All right, I'm here again with Hannah Maralia, and I've enjoyed her comments. I hope you have too on the discussion threads. And she, of course, is the faculty assistant for the class. I like to think of it as like a co-teacher. And one of the neat things and neat perspectives I thought she could bring is talking about literature and myth, and even some of the stories in the Bible as it relates to children, because obviously. Uh, there are certain stories that we've already looked at that wouldn't be appropriate for children. And but she's an elementary ed major. Has already actually done some teaching with elementary students. I know some people even in this class have some ambitions to teach children, and some have ambitions to have children. So I just want to ask Hannah to start off with, how is it? How does a teacher or a parent or someone, how do they draw that line for what's appropriate for children?
Um, well, I think that we already kind of do draw those lines in a lot of ways. We were talking about this yesterday, that when we tell biblical stories, often we leave out really gruesome parts or
Mhm.
parts that kids may not understand or be able to grasp yet. But we do keep the central themes and messages, and just kind of pick out those big events. For example, if you're telling a kid the story of David and Goliath, yeah, you're going to tell about David's courage and him throwing the stone and knocking Goliath over, but you're probably going to leave out the part about him cutting off Goliath's
Cutting
head.
right.
I don't think most kids are ready for that detail. So, yeah, I guess, and I think it's probably subjective as well, with you as a parent or as a teacher, what's going to be appropriate and what's.
And we've been talking quite a bit about the Lot story, which is a kind of a troublesome story even for grown-ups. But it's interesting that we rarely tell that part of the story where after they've been saved and they're up kind of in this cave, and Lot's daughters, I don't know, get a little revenge, if you will, on dad, but also kind of keep their family line going.
Mhm.
They get him drunk, and they essentially rape their dad and have children with their dad. We don't usually tell that part
No,
to
not
children.
normally.
So, although even the parts that we do tell, we often tidy up a bit. We don't always explain to them what the men and the boys are wanting
Right.
from the guests.
Mhm.
For you as a teacher, what would those lines be like when you're teaching in your classroom? Have you thought about what your lines are going to be for? And maybe it depends on what grade you have.
Yeah, I would definitely say it depends on what grade you have, because a fourth grader isn't going to be ready for some of the stuff that an eighth grader would be. I don't
Do you
know.
think an eighth grader is ready? I mean, when is an
Oh,
eighth?
for like some of
Hmm.
the myths that you guys are studying. Maybe some of them, but I will say that I didn't have a lot of experience with fifth through eighth before I did my student teaching this last semester. And after I got to know the kids and see what they were like, I did realize that age is still very young. And so
Hmm.
I actually my lines on some of the content that I might teach probably has changed over this semester as I've gotten to know um, the kids, because they are ready for higher level thinking and some of those higher level ideas, but they are still kids. And yeah, it's definitely, you need to take care with what you share
Hmm.
with them.
You
But I
know,
do think they might be ready for some of the myths.
yeah. Not to put you on a spot, but um, probably some of the most famous myths that children are familiar with are our fairy tales,
Mm-hmm.
the Grimm's fairy tales. But people have often been critical of, say, the Disney versions, as if they're kind of uh, sanitized versions, because a lot of people don't know those fairy tales weren't intended for children. They were intended kind of for everybody.
Right.
What's your opinion on that? On what Disney has done to some of those, or even what we sometimes do with some of those?
I think it's great. I mean, I think a lot of the fairy tales, well, a lot of the fairy tales have been kind of made into nicer pictures, but I think it makes us enjoy them more and want to go back to those stories. And it still teaches good morals and lessons through them too. So personally, I would much rather watch The Little Mermaid, the Disney version, than hear the original gruesome tale. So
Yes.
I'm fine with it.
Yes, for those of you who don't know, because a lot of people don't know this, in the Hans Christian Andersen version of The Little Mermaid, the witch wins.
Right.
The mermaid doesn't get the prince. She ends up dying. It's actually a terrible story because she ends up dying and becoming sea foam.
Oh.
So every time you see the sea foam coming up on the shore, that's dead Ariel. What a happy story.
That's
So
a way to look at
right, it's a terrifying story. So I personally don't want my children to hear that.
No. The Disney one is full of a lot more hope and
Right.
and good things. Yeah.
Right. In defense of the Hans Christian Andersen or the Grimms or any of the fairy tales, it's actually a very modern idea, modern meaning like within the last 150 years, that we even actually have the idea of children's literature. Because it used to be children would be exposed either just to very didactic teaching or to the same thing that the adults heard. So, Gilgamesh. Okay, so Gilgamesh is not one we traditionally teach to children. But it's fascinating. It's a wonderful story. Just judging from our class, some people really enjoyed it. Would you teach Gilgamesh to your kids? I mean, it's got a whole part where you've got a wild man. It's kind of like Tarzan, who gets tamed by this woman with 7 days of sex. Would you even tell this story, or would you just tell them would you create a sanitized version? Or would you just not bother with it?
Well, if I was going to share it, I would definitely sanitize it. Yeah, I think there's a lot of material in there that just kids may not be ready to be exposed to. Yeah, I would at least consider telling it to kids. I think that, well, fairy tales, but also myths are great ways to explore different lessons and morals and feelings that kids are aware of, but they may not know how to express yet, and different like real world problems. They may not face the same problems as in Gilgamesh, but I think that myths can be a great way to teach those things. So I would at least consider teaching Gilgamesh. I would definitely sanitize it though.
Right. One of my favorite quotes from Chesterton, and I don't remember exactly how it goes. Maybe someone can Google it, but so I'm going to butcher it. But he was defending teaching myths and fairy tales to children.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I loved what he said, and I know I'm going to butcher it, but essentially he said, we don't teach fairy tales to children because for fear that they will learn that dragons are real. They already know dragons are real. What fairy tales teach us is that dragons can be defeated.
Oh, I love that.
And I love that. Yeah, I do too. I think obviously children know better than we realize that there aren't dragons.
Right. Yeah.
But what a lot of these stories teach us is they teach us hope. They teach us we have characters who work hard often. You have a Cinderella story. Cinderella, yes, she gets a little help from magic, but it's really a story about somebody who's worked hard.
Oh, yeah.
And just gets rewarded for hard work. And I think that gives people courage in that sense.
And I think kids are much more perceptive of those lessons in stories than we sometimes give them credit for too.
Now, this week, of course, we just wrapped up the Odyssey, and the Odyssey is one of those stories that I think that can easily be told to children as long as you don't maybe tell the graphic parts. Oedipus, so maybe a harder one to tell to children, because here's a play, a wonderful play, a delightful play about fate.
Mhm.
And you have a story where you have Oedipus, who from the time he was born is predicted that he's going to marry his mother and kill his father. And of course, everyone does everything they can to make sure it doesn't happen, which means they end up doing on accident everything that needs to happen for him to kill his father and marry his mother. Terrible! What a terrible story. There's no way in the world Disney is going to be able to make this movie.
Oh, no.
So you're not going to see Oedipus, the Disney version, at any time. But what about a story like this, though? Because it is teaching something of interest, and that is the role of fate. Are children ready for fate, or is that a little too grown up? The idea that we may not always be in control of what's going on in our lives.
Hmm.
Or that's a hard one.
It is a hard one. And I think, honestly, that concept is kind of tricky for adults, too.
Mhm.
But like I was saying earlier, I think kids are often more perceptive and receptive to those
Mhm.
ideas than we think they are. So they may not immediately grasp or understand if you were to just tell them that story, or you were to just start waxing eloquent about
Mhm.
fate. But if you maybe put it in real life examples, if you broke it down for them in a certain way, they may be able to grasp those
Mhm.
those concepts, especially when you get up to the older grades,
Right.
6th, 7th, 8th.
That's right.
Yeah,
Certainly by high school,
oh,
they're
yeah.
ready to talk about
And they're
these things.
interested in that kind of stuff too. There are
Mhm.
many kids who would thoroughly discuss those things with you, even if it maybe isn't at that higher level of high
Right.
school, college, adult.
And if there are any students who are going into high school teaching, Oedipus actually is a fascinating play. The first time I encountered it was when I was in high school, and I found it incredibly engaging. Not everyone in my class did, but I was kind of nerdy, and I thought that was super interesting. Not to put you on the spot, but do you have a favorite, or maybe a couple of favorite, either fairy tales, folk tales, or myths, and maybe even a favorite Bible story? Because some of those stories affect us in the same way. And I probably should have asked you that in advance.
It's all right. From the Bible, I really love the life of David, just in general. So a lot of stories from there. The one that comes to mind immediately, though, is David being chosen as king, where all of these really accomplished and strong men are lined up, and then you have little David on the end. He's the one that gets chosen. Does that count as a myth?
Absolutely it does. It's I would say every aspect of the David story counts as a myth, in the sense that we talked about, not as, in the way we sometimes say untrue, but as such a central story. I think the story of David is so central to the Old and the New Testament. So because you ultimately have Jesus, who becomes kind of the new David, and even the aspects of David's life where he's not the one you would think. There's nothing that seems super special about him. That resonates with us, because I think we feel that way sometimes. And it fits very well with the idea of Jesus. There's nothing about him that we would say that he was, more, had advantage, to say, over others. So I love that. And I would go so far, and I've mentioned this in the discussions, that the scholars, biblical literature scholars, often cite 1st and 2nd Samuel, and it's actually one book but 2 scrolls, so Samuel, as the most literarily perfect writing in the Bible.
Really?
It's and I am in that camp. I love Genesis. Genesis is my favorite book of the Bible, but Samuel is the most extraordinary writing.
Mhm.
There is nothing to match it. And since I consider the Bible to be the greatest literature, perhaps that's my way of saying Samuel and the story of David might be the greatest literary document that we have. So, and it also springs prequels, like you have the story of Ruth, which is really just a prequel of how we get David,
Right.
which is also a wonderful story. So, well, I really appreciate you sharing this with us. And again, so when you see Hannah, this is who she is. And she also works in the a student life. So, so if you happen to see her there, pop in if you're here on campus, and you can chat with her as well. Thank you so much. And I've got a discussion question for you at the end of this. And so I want you to pay attention to what that is and respond to that. And thank you so much. I'm going to try to find out how to turn this off.